Hi, this is lecture 5, and in this lecture I'm going to talk about the final project for the course, which is not due until the end of the term on December 10th. But as you'll see, there are a few steps involved, so I wanted to go ahead and introduce it now so that you can start thinking about it and be prepared for when those benchmarks come up across the remainder of the course. So this is the handout, which is already in D2L. So please do take a look at it and read it carefully. But I also want to kind of go through it right now. Okay. So this is the sort of research component of this course. As you may recall, this course is what we call an ELEX, which means that it's a course that is both open to students from any major and also has a specific kind of activity embedded in it. And in this case, the activity is a research project. Okay, so here's what you're going to be doing for this project. As I say here, what I'm asking you to do is to produce an 8 to 10 page research paper, and it's going to be based on what I'm referring to as a commodity chain. So what that means is you're going to choose one commodity or product, and you're going to trace the production and consumption of that product over time and across space. And specifically, you're going to choose a commodity that is connected in some way to gender, sexuality, and or the body, right? So in keeping with the themes of the course. I've given you a list here. This is just some things I thought of. It's not exhaustive. You don't need to be limited by the list, but I wanted to get your sort of mind working on the kinds of things that might work for this. So I've thrown out a bunch of examples. Feel free to choose one of those. Feel free to choose one and modify it, like by making it more specific, for example, or feel free to propose a different item. There's a proposal process that I'll talk about in a few minutes, so you're welcome to start with something else, right? But the main thing is that it needs to be a commodity that is clearly connected to gender, sexuality, and or the gendered sexed body, okay? So again, we want this to be a mechanism for you to think about some of the themes of the course. All right. So as I said, we're starting from this idea of a commodity chain. The idea of a commodity chain is that products, commodities circulate in the global economy, right? Meaning they pass through various sets of hands from their creation to their consumption, right? And even beyond that, right? There are lots of commodities that are consumed by some folks and then reconsumed in a used form, for example, right? So the idea here is to try to trace that out to some extent, right? So I give you some prompts to think about tracing that path. For example, where, how, and by whom is the product made? Where, when, and why do people consume it? What are the historical and contemporary meanings attached to this product that underlies consumption? And how have those meanings evolved over time, okay? So a commodity chain is a kind of approach to thinking about both culture and sort of the broader economic, political, cultural system in which those products are embedded as a vehicle for thinking about, how people live their lives, imagine their identities, all of those things, right? So this is just one way to get at some of the themes of the course, but it's one that I think is an interesting sort of framework, and it allows you to focus on a very specific thing in the interest of illuminating much broader processes and insights. Okay. So, again, I'm not going to read the entire handout, but I do, down at the bottom of page 1, also have a link to just one example of an anthropologist doing something like this. This particular anthropologist is tracing the movement of used clothing from places like the United States to other parts of the world. Her long-term field work is in the African country Zambia. So what she shows is both sort of where that used clothing comes from and what the context is and how it's used and understood, how it sort of has meaning in the places where it lands. So if you've ever, for example, been to a Goodwill and thought, my gosh, they're just racks and racks and racks of clothes. Like, how do they sell all this? The fact is they don't, right? About half at least, of the especially used clothes that charities and other kinds of organizations like Goodwill take in, they can't sell. So what they do is, through other intermediary companies, they pack them up in big giant bales, right? And they ship them across the ocean, right, to other countries. And in this case, this anthropologist is talking about Zambia, where they are, land in the hands of, for example, people who sell items in markets locally, and they're consumed by people in those communities, right? And again, as you'll see if you read this article, the way those used clothing items are, again, put on people's bodies, the meanings they take on, all that stuff is part of this commodity chain of this particular item. So that's just one example. If you're interested, you can read this article and just get a sense of like one person's approach to it. All right. You don't need to do it exactly like her. Of course, she's a professional anthropologist, but it's just something that you might think about to get the gears turning. Okay. Moving on to page 2 of the handout. This is more like the nuts and bolts of what you're going to be doing. Okay. So the first thing is that I point out that this project is not, don't think of it as a report. So in other words, the point is not to simply list all the things you learned about your product, right? Like an encyclopedia entry might do. Instead, it's a research paper, right? So what that means is you are going to find out all that information about your product, but then you're going to analyze it and interpret it, and try to come to some conclusions of your own, right? So you'll make some kind of argument about what you saw in those materials and what you think is important about it, okay? We'll talk about that more down the line. In terms of collecting information, that'll be the basis for this paper. What I'm asking you to do is to use a minimum of 8 sources, 8 published sources, okay? And at least 4 of those need to be scholarly. That means peer-reviewed, and you will find them primarily in the Northeastern Library databases, okay? As I say, you can use class readings if they're relevant. That could be among your 4. But it'll definitely improve your paper if you go looking in the databases for some sources that are much more specific to the commodity that you choose, all right? So I don't think it will be possible for the most part to cobble together 4 readings from class that will really allow you insight into that specific subject, all right? But if you find, say, one of the readings that has a theoretical, like one of the readings from class that has a theoretical approach that you think is valuable for you understanding your commodity, then you can use that, right? So 4 are scholarly sources. The other 4 can be scholarly. You can do all 8 scholarly, but I'm saying the other 4 could be other kinds of things, right? So since you're talking about, a product, there are other kinds of sources that will have information about them. It might be newspaper accounts. It might be actual, trade journals, right? Like the industries that produce this stuff have their own kinds of publications. They're not scholarly publications, but they'll talk about the nature of that industry. It can also be pop culture sources, right? So for example, if you're writing about a particular clothing item, you might find a useful article in Glamour magazine, right? The important point on combining scholarly and non-scholarly sources, as I say here in the handout, is it's fine to use both for this paper. I'm saying you can, for sure. But the key to using them effectively is being clear on which kind of source brings you what, right? And being clear about the distinction between the different kinds of sources in how you write about them in the paper. So, for example, as I say here, Glamour magazine is not an appropriate source for an analytical framework, right? For that, you would need to draw on academic work, right? But Glamour may provide useful information on the favored skirt lengths of a certain year, right? On the other hand, an anthropologist's account of culturally specific notions of modesty may help you analyze what you learn about skirt lengths from Glamour magazine, right? So in other words, in a discussion where you're using both scholarly and non-scholarly sources, you want to use them for what they are and represent them for what they are, okay? If you do that and you navigate between the things that Glamour magazine can and can't tell you and the things that your scholarly sources can and can't tell you, that would be great, okay? So in terms of the format, pretty standard, submitted as a Word or PDF, standard formatting issues. And for citing sources, I am strongly encouraging you to use the Chicago Manual of Style author date citation style. I have a style guide in D2L that you can draw from. That is the most commonly used citation style in the field of cultural anthropology. So that is the reason for choosing it, and it makes sense for the papers to be done using a certain format, right? And it also just gives you specific instructions. I'm not going to have you all go into different style guides and trying to navigate them. We'll just be using this, which is, I think, a quite straightforward way to cite sources, okay? So if you're not familiar with that particular style, look at the style guide in D2L. All right. Okay. So the final part of the handout is the schedule and the specifics of each step in this process. This information is also in D2L, but here I've kind of put it all together in one spot on the handout so you can see the path we're taking. So the first step is going to be a proposal, and that's due October 27th. So I give you the specific prompts I want you to ask. It's not going to be a lengthy document, but I do I would like you to answer specific questions. First, of course, like, which thing did you pick, right? And then why did you choose it, right? And that's really to understand sort of where you're coming from, what attracted you to this particular subject, because I also think articulating that will help you move toward framing your paper and figuring out what you want to know about that commodity, right? And then finally, for the proposal, I do want you to list a couple of sources, at least one scholarly. They can both be scholarly. And please use complete bibliographic information, right? So an entry like you would on a references cited page, so I can see like all the info I need about it, right? So again, this is still early days in the project in October, but having already gone into the databases and looked for what's out there and started to compile a provisional sort of bibliography or set of sources is going to be a really important step for you to start, again, thinking about the whole paper. So having you identify at least 2 of those sources for the proposal is part of that. Then in November, we'll have an update, right? So for that, I'm going to, again, have you write a fairly brief thing, but it's just to kind of check in and see where you're going, what's going on, and troubleshoot if there's any challenges, right? So for the update in November, you'll explain what you've done, what you're still planning to do, what you've learned, right? Are there themes emerging? Is there anything surprising or interesting that came out of the research you've done? And then troubleshooting. Are there any challenges, right? Like, are there things you don't know how to deal with? Is it too big? Is it too small, right? The subject, that is. So that will also give us an opportunity to check in and for me to give you some feedback if there are things that are challenging you long before the paper's due, right? So then the final step is, of course, submitting the final paper. This is, at the end of the semester. I'll talk more before we get to that about the process of sort of synthesizing the sources that you find, developing an argument, and actually putting together the paper. But for now, I did want to give you just the overall format of what it's going to look like. So an 8 to 10 page paper, and I am going to ask you to organize it in a particular way, where you're going to have the title, an introduction section, where you will have the thesis to your paper. That is the sort of argument or framing idea for the whole thing. After that intro, you'll go into sort of the discussion. First about here's what I found, here's what the publications say, etc. And then either as part of that section or in a separate section, what's the significance of all those different things that you found, right? Having synthesized, here's the gist of what I'm finding, here's what the scholarly sources say, here's how the scholarly sources connect to the non-scholarly sources, or whatever it may be for your topic. How does that demonstrate or support the argument that I'm putting out about this commodity? And then a conclusion and a references cited section. So again, more to come on that. For now, I suggest looking at that list and or brainstorming a product that you think might be a good fit for you and for this project. And then starting to, look in the databases and sort of think about, what's out there and how it might help you move forward. I will note that in terms of finding sources through the library, I've got some info here. You will need to use those academic databases to find information. Especially given the nature of the subjects here, if you just Google it, you will probably find a lot of non-scholarly sources before you find scholarly sources. So I do, again, I think you really need to go to the databases. I link them here, right? If you're not familiar with how to find them, on the Northeastern Library's homepage, right on the front page, there's a thing that says databases, right? And I gave you that link here, where you'll see a long list of, these are full text collections of peer-reviewed sources that you can search within to find items for your paper. I suggested a couple of those databases, which are very broad, multidisciplinary databases that you might want to start with. I'm going to imagine that many of you have already used them, but even if you haven't, Academic Search Ultimate and JSTOR are two of the databases that have tons of different materials, like from lots of different subjects, different academic fields, across many different journals. There are even some like book chapters. So there's a lot of stuff in there across a broad range. So again, that might be a place to start. And then look through that list of databases. There's some more specific ones that you might find relevant to your own paper, okay? So this is our plan, and this video is meant really just as an introduction to that and to put it on your radar and to get you thinking, right? For any paper, I think choosing what you're going to focus on is a really important step, right? Pick something that you actually are intrigued by or interested by, or you do want to know more about it, right? Lots of options. Feel free to run ideas by me just by email if you want to, but there's kind of no wrong answer for what you choose. Again, just bear in mind that we want it to be a commodity that clearly connects to gender, sexuality, and or the gendered sexed body, so that it becomes a lens to provide more understanding of the themes of the course. Okay, that's it. We'll talk again soon. Bye.